So I'm extremely happy to be here and overjoyed to be named a co-recipient of this year's 2020 Lillian Smith Book Award. I want to thank the University of Georgia Libraries, Southern Regional Council, Georgia Center for the Book, as well as Piedmont College. I also want to recognize the legacy of Lillian Smith. It's always great when people recognize your work or your contributions to the field, but it is even more significant when you can receive an award that bears the namesake of someone who was truly a freedom fighter, someone who was truly outspoken, someone who stood in the gap when it was extremely unpopular to do, and to stand up for humanity, stand up for human rights, stand up for democracy and justice for all. So I'm extremely and deeply honored to be the recipient of this year's 2020 Lillian Smith Book Award. And thank you for having me. Like so many Black folks in this country, I am the product of a historically Black college and university, also known as an HBCU. These institutions have served as the cornerstones of the Black liberation movement, producing ministers, producing teachers, producing lawyers and doctors, but also producing activists, as well as professions of every kind. I myself, I am a proud graduate, as you heard, of actually, it wasn't mentioned that I was a graduate of North Carolina A&T State University, only the Ohio State University, but I began my intellectual roots at North Carolina A&T State University, where I graduated from there in 1997. But on February the 1st, 1960, 4 freshman students sat down at a Woolworth's counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and in doing so, they launched the direct phase of the modern, direct action phase of the modern civil rights movement. And this is a movement, this is a development, political and social development, which still reverberates throughout our country to this very day. I finished A&T in 1997, and it was then that I made my way to Columbus, Ohio to go to graduate school at, again, the Ohio State University. I began in the master's program in African American Studies, and I came under the tutelage of Dr. William Nelson, Jr. Now, when I was at A&T, we talked a lot about the sit-ins. We talked a lot about the civil rights movement. And when I arrived at Ohio State, I didn't really want to continue down that path. That was something that I thought that I had exhausted, but it was Dr. Nelson who actually first encouraged me to take a second look, to dig deeper, and that indeed the story of student activism had never really been fully told. And so I began to do that. I did a master's thesis under his direction, and then I came across the street to the history department where I began my PhD in history in 2000. And it was there in that program that I took a class under Dr. Beverly Gordon at Ohio State University, and it was entitled The History of Black Education. And that was one of the most profound, one of the most impactful classes that I ever took. It was in that class that Dr. Gordon introduced us to scholars such as V.P. Franklin, scholars such as James Anderson, who wrote the incredibly classic and incredibly important book, The History of Blacks in Higher Education. But she also introduced me to the work of Vanessa Siddle Walker. Vanessa Siddle Walker, ironically, won this award last year for her book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate. All these scholars and so many more made an extreme impact on my understanding on the history of Black education. But the holes and the voids that they were filling dealt with mostly the legacy and the role of Black teachers. And it led me to raise a question. Well, if these teachers are making such a profound impact and effect, how do we get these teachers? Who trained these teachers? And that was a story which I believe had not truly been filled. Enter one of the most important mentors in my life, Dr. Hassan Jeffries, who came to Ohio State around the same time that I was beginning my PhD program. And Dr. Jeffries served as an incredible mentor for me and encouraged me to take a much stronger look at the role of Black colleges and institutions. In fact, before I left to go to Mississippi to begin my research, comparative study of Tougaloo and Jackson State, it was Dr. Jeffries who told me that the historian's job is to get the reader to rethink what they thought they already knew, right? To rethink what you thought you already knew. And again, so many historians and scholars had attempted to tell the story of Black colleges through these same old lenses of classism and conservatism and paternalism and colorism. All these things certainly existed on Black college campuses, but none of those things answered the questions of how do we get someone like an Ella Baker? How do we get someone like a Stokely Carmichael? How do we get someone like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Ruby Doris Smith or Diane Nash? How do we produce these type of activists? Because all of them, their roots are within historically Black colleges. And so I began to dig deeper, and I went down into Mississippi, and it was there that I immediately began to get the answer to my question. I came across in the Jackson State University newspaper of 1945, I came across the writings of a woman by the name of Onezime Clark. And as I often joke with people, that's as Southern and as Mississippi as you're going to get right there, Onezime Clark. But she offered this very profound and beautiful prayer for the class of 1945. And this is what she said in that prayer. She said, quote, "Grant us, O God, the ability as prospective teachers to inspire instead of to discourage, to give light where there is darkness, to help where it is needed, and to fight for justice for all." I'll say that again, to fight for justice for all. Unless, oh God, we're able to do these things, there will be so few leaders and great men and women of tomorrow that the progress of our race will be impeded. Today we launch, oh God, teach us how to sail and where to anchor. That was in 1945. I continued to pour through the student newspapers of Jackson State University and Tougaloo College, and I continued to receive an abundance of evidence pointing to the politicization and even radicalization of Black youth during this era. And again, this is a story which really had not been told. I came across the words of Johnny Edwards, who again offered a conclusion for me in terms of really sealing the fact that these institutions were planting seeds of activism and agency amongst these youth. Johnny Edwards said this in 1949 as a graduate of Jackson State University. He says, "We are moving forward to serve humanity, and we have been thoroughly oriented in how to solve our own problems. For our teacher training has been directed towards social ends, that is, toward the perpetuation, progress, and welfare of all men. We realize that the educational objectives that we now possess should become consciously integrated with all social organization to the end that the educational objectives may determine the direction of social change, whereby all men would reap the benefits of our democratic society." Direction of social change, reaping the benefits of a democratic society. This is what students and young people who attended these institutions were saying in the 1940s in the belly of the beast, Mississippi, right? In the sweltering, oppressive environment of Mississippi. But again, as I came across these students, the next question became, well, who was teaching them, right? And so I began to uncover the works and the writings of people like Octavius Catto at Cheyney State University, which began as the Institute for Colored Youth, people like Fannie Jackson Coppin, people like Margaret Walker and Jane McAllister at Jackson State University, people such as Joanne Robinson at Alabama State University, and the president of Alabama State University, Harper Council Trenholm. These people acted again as mentors, as seed planters, as they began to engage with Black youth. And they promoted what I refer to in my work as the second curriculum, which is a curriculum which is not like math or Latin or Greek or biology, but this was a curriculum deeply rooted in what I refer to as racial consciousness, idealism, and cultural nationalism. These were the three things that I continue to see over and over again continue to blossom on these institutions. And it was, again, Dr. Hassan Jeffries who strongly encouraged me when I finished my PhD in 2006 to try to take on this extremely long, ambitious project of telling a broader story of the legacy and the role of historically Black colleges and universities. So I added to that study, not 2, not 3, but 7 institutions to try to fill in that gap. When I was a student at North Carolina A&T as an undergraduate, we had a conference in the history department known as Missing Pages. And that's exactly what I tried to do with my research and this monograph, is to fill in those missing pages of historically Black colleges to help us understand how, through the agency and through the proliferation of the second curriculum, Black students were exposed to a long history of race consciousness and idealism and cultural nationalism. Over and over again, students were talking about citizenship and democracy. They were being drilled in it, trained in it, during an era where Black folks were constantly denied citizenship and democracy. And so these were the intellectual roots, the seeds of my book. And again, I began this project. I received tremendous support from Duke University, who invested in this project not once, but twice with a fellowship to help me bring it to its fruition. And in last year, 2019, this book finally came to life, Shelter in a Time of Storm: How Black Colleges Fostered Generations of Leadership and Activism, telling the story of 7 historically Black colleges and universities. The Institute for Colored Youth, also known as Cheyney State University, founded in 1837, is where I began my story. I continued also by retelling the story of Tougaloo during the Nadir. I moved forward from there to tell the story of Bennett College, one of 2 single-sex institutions dedicated to educating African-American women. From there, I told the story of 3 institutions in the midst of this post-World War II environment, which I felt was the largest gap in our understanding. So between the 1930s through the 1950s, that story really had not been filled in. And so I attempted to tell that story by looking at the roles of Jackson State University, looking at the roles of Alabama State University, and the role played by Southern University. And then I conclude by telling the story of what William Chase said was the center of the Black Power movement in the South, Greensboro, North Carolina, by looking at it through the lens of North Carolina A&T State University, my alma mater. Then I conclude with my epilogue, which tries to make sense and bring the story full circle. It was truly a labor of love and an emphasis on labor. So I'm extremely grateful that the Lillian Smith Book Award and the jurors of the Lillian Smith Book Award looked upon this book very favorably, who truly believed that I was indeed filling in a missing page, a page which informs us of our past, but also gives us an understanding of our present as well. What role can these institutions still play, still serve in continuing to plant seeds of agency amongst its students? We are living in a very tense moment where once again, white supremacy, racism, racial violence is very much appearing on the scene in the same ways in which it has appeared in past generations. What answers can these institutions provide for us as we continue to move forward? And I hope that this book will answer that in some ways, again, not just telling the story of the past, but also highlighting what the ultimate question of what now? How do we address these issues that are continuing to plague us? And I do believe that the history and legacy of Black colleges hold some answers to how we can address this by continuing to develop students like Oneza May Clark and Johnny Edwards and the countless other students who emerged from these institutions and declared that they were going to be agents of change. Thank you once again to the Lillian Smith Book Award. Thank you to the jurors. And I'm extremely, again, grateful to be this year's honoree for the Lillian Smith Book Award. Thank you.